I just wanted to give a shout out to the people who are operating all the fancy high-tech equipment today. There's a couple of different groups. Royal Productions is operating the cameras for us. We appreciate that. And on the webcasting is OVS Media, Online Video Service Media. They've been doing this for a number of years, and boy, it has run really smooth this year, so we appreciate their work. OVS has developed an app that's attached to their online viewer, the webcast, so they can look at where people are looking in from around the country, and it does an automatic calculation of how much carbon has been saved by people watching online versus flying to come here to New Orleans. And it kind of cuts both ways for me that's trying to fill up the room, but as of just a couple of minutes ago, we have saved 161,400 pounds of carbon from people that are watching online versus traveling here to see it in person. So a shout out to them for that app and for PHMSA for helping pay for it. So now I'd like to introduce Sarah Gosman, who is on our board. She's our board's vice president. She's also at the University of Arkansas School of Law, and she's going to talk about the hot topic about should pipelines have permits to operate. Geez, I got to get a permit to put a deck on the back of my house. You mean pipelines don't have to have a permit to operate? What's that all about?
Trust Carl to make it controversial before I begin, right? Okay. So I teach at the University of Arkansas School of Law, and I teach environmental law and energy law, and I'm actually coming into this presentation having just finished teaching both the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, which have, of course, permits. So it is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. So this is one way of thinking about this issue, right? So when I was reading the State Department EIS on Keystone, and you know, it was amazing to me, and I teach environmental law, that there were over 90 permits, licenses, approvals, authorizations, consultations for that particular project before it was implemented, and that does not include, of course, the presidential permit and approval. And so one question you might ask coming off of that is, but not one from PHMSA. So lots of other permits, but on the core pipeline safety issues and the conditions that would have been attached to the operation of that pipeline, no permit. So I just want to start with real basics, and apologies to those of you who know this material well, but just so we're all on the same page. So when I talk about a permit, I'm talking about it in a particular legal context. And what a permit is permission, right? It's an affirmative grant of permission allowing an act that is otherwise prohibited, and prohibited usually by statute. So the standard language in, say, the Clean Water Act, for example, is you are prohibited from discharging a pollutant into the waters of the United States, navigable waters, except if you get a permit from the EPA. So we start out with a presumption that the activity is actually prohibited, and we move then to the question of permitted under what conditions, right? And I was thinking about this last night as I was preparing for this presentation, and to me this seems very similar to the discussion around a social license. That is, you start out with the idea that we don't accept activities except if they're done in a way that is environmentally sound, right? Sound from a safety perspective, sound generally from a sort of social and community perspective. How do we do that? Administratively, we do that through the permitting process. So when we talk about permits, we're talking about these permissions that are applied to specified regulated actions and actors. There's often both an activity component to this as well as a particular actor involved. Has a specified duration. Permits can run the gamut from very short to very long. The longer permits tend to have revisions, usually every 5, every 10 years. And then imposes enforceable conditions. So the permit itself you might think of as a contract, right? You're imposing particular conditions on the permittee through this particular piece of paper. So to me, as a law professor, I think there are a couple of really interesting characteristics. Oh, I should stop here and say a lot of this material actually comes from a really interesting law review article. So probably not your reading generally law review articles, but this law review article is really great. It comes out of the Duke Law Journal. It was actually published pretty recently, so I put the site on the last slide in case you want to read it. So key characteristics of permitting. So first of all, authorized by statute. We start out with a congressional determination that permits are important to the program. Next, we have an administrative decision maker. This is administratively done. And of course, that's the key part because we're using discretion here to make a particular decision. Another very key aspect is public participation. That is, this is a vehicle for the public to weigh in on a particular set of risks and give its opinion. And finally, and I think just as importantly, it's judicially reviewable. That is, we create a particular agency action that can then be challenged through the courts. So there are different types of permits, and sometimes when the discussion around permits happens, people think about what are called individual permits or specific permits. And I think that's what PHMSA's special permit, right, sort of waiver permit is, in effect. It's a individual permit. So it applies to a particular activity. The decisions are made after an application. So once the application is in, that's when the agency uses its discretion and comes up with a particular conditions. That's not the only type of permit out there. And in fact, general permits, the next category, are quite extensively used in the administrative state. These apply to a general class of activities. They look more like rules than they do like the standard straight up specific permit. And the decisions are really made initially, right? There is public participation. There is a discussion and thinking about risk in a particular context. There are conditions, but all of these are thought of up front. And if you fit within the category, right, for whom this general permit is intended, then you can use it at that point. And at that point, right, the process goes smoothly on. So you might think, for example, of the wetlands program. I'm sure that many operators have had to deal with a wetlands program, right? So wetlands permits, a lot of them are general permits. And then there's sort of a hybrid model, which doesn't have a fancy name, right? But basically usually starts out as a general permit, but has more individualized administration. So we might apply this to a general class of activities, but we require notification that those activities are going to take place. And there's some sort of initial review of the activity itself that we're going to permit. Some review as to whether it fits within this category, perhaps some review as to additional conditions we might want to place on it. Again, this is something that I think is a good example, comes out of the wetlands, Section 404 permitting. So why do we have permits? We have permits for a number of reasons, and I think these are the main ones, but I think people could come up with other ones. So the first one is really it's a way to gather information. So both at the application side as well as through monitoring and reporting requirements. It's also a way to think about tailoring regulation to risk. And you do that through this particular application and through then the decision. It's a way to include the public in decision making. And it's a way to improve enforcement. That is, you know more about the regulated entities, and thus you have the ability to determine when things go wrong. And here I think in part because the device itself, right, gives you information that you might not otherwise have. So generally in the legal literature, when you think about the rationale for specific versus general, it comes down to this. When you have a higher risk of harm, you tend to want specific permits because then that individualized context matters a lot. When you are worried about what we call transactions costs, right, but basically costs of permitting, of complying with permits, you think more about general permits. General permits are cheaper and they are more efficient in that particular model. So what are the arguments against, right? And again, I think there can be a long list here, but what are the main ones that you often see are high costs, right? I think the general permit tends to push back a little bit against that argument, but certainly it costs something, quite a lot sometimes, right, to put in a permit application. It costs also for the agency. There are administrative costs to a permitting system. It can be a barrier to entry for small firms if costs are really significant. And again, I would say this, and I would also say that general permits handle some of that concern, perhaps not all of that concern. And apologies to PHMSA in the room, right, but one of the key concerns about permitting often comes down to agency abuse of permitting power. So people who are concerned about permits, again, in the legal literature often talk about the discretion, and they're concerned about the ways in which that discretion is handled. So what would an operational permit for a pipeline look like? And I start here, actually, I did a bit of a review to try to figure out, okay, so do we have operational permits for pipelines, right? So I know about the special permit, and that's, of course, the reverse burden. I mean, here, what PHMSA does with this special permit is they say, go forth, right? Unless you want to do something different, then come to us for permit, rather than prohibited, come to us for permission. That's a very different model, although, it is, I suppose, in the classical sort of sense, a permit. So I found Texas has an operational permit, and if anybody is here from Texas, I'd love to hear about how that process works. But when I looked at the permits online, they really are pretty simple. I mean, there's a couple page application, but then the permit itself basically says, we've looked at your particular pipeline, we've assessed it against our regulations, we have determined that you are in compliance with the laws, right? So it can be as simple as that. So I'd love, again, after I finish, I'd love examples, if you have them, of this type of permitting. Operational permits separate from construction permits, we do this in environmental law particularly. Title V is probably the classic example in the Clean Air Act context of a particular permit that's operational rather than construction-based. So what would that operational permit look like? Well, it would require a comprehensive review of pipeline risks prior to operation and at regular intervals. And this is, I think, one big reason to have an operational permit. We, of course, hope that everybody complies with the regulations on the books, but this gives a vehicle to look at that particular information prior to construction. You can tailor regulation through permit conditions. And here I think about the permit conditions that were on the Keystone XL pipeline. Those were conditions that went above and beyond the particular sets of requirements. And they, to me, seem like a set of conditions that you could use within the context of permitting. They include monitoring and reporting requirements. Now, these are already in place, right? But part of, I think, administratively, what's nice about a permit is you bring everything together. It's one document, and it explains clearly what, say, an operator should be doing. You can revoke the permit, and thus revoke the ability to operate the pipeline if the permit terms are violated. So that may strike some of you as draconian, perhaps it is, right? But this is a big part of what it means to have a permit, is the ability to shut down based on violations of permit terms. And I think here, I don't think necessarily a specific permit is the right outcome here, although it could be. But there are ways of thinking about this where you might have, say, specific permits for high-risk areas, think high-consequence areas, right? And general permits for areas in which we might have less concern about risk, or maybe we want to have some hybrid version where we have what looks like a general permit with a little more engagement, right, by the operator at the point of beginning operation, a bit more review by PHMSA. So those are my thoughts, and I leave you with this of many cartoons out there about the joys of permitting, right? A lot of them actually relate to building permits. I completely understand that, having just working on restoring my 1922 house, right? But you need a permit to fish here. I'm doing okay with a worm, thank you, right? I mean, this is the standard sort of back and forth about, really, I'm doing okay, don't mess with me, and the other person saying, hey, you really do need a permit to do this. We're concerned about whatever, right? You catching too much fish. So with that, I will stop and hopefully, Yeah, 13 minutes. All right. But I would love comments, questions about this concept. Thank you.
Any